everyone. Hope you all are having a good Sunday morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm at the annual space, but I'm in our storage room, so there's not echoes because we are having it live streamed out there. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to take a moment in the beginning to do some introductions and some thank yous, and then we'll dive right into the work. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Madeline Gent. I'm the Executive Director here at Associated Artists of Pittsburgh. We are celebrating our 108th annual exhibition with artwork on view at the Detective Building in East Liberty. Today is the last day to see that work, as well as additional work at the Pittsburgh International Airport. I'm sure many of us have, many of you know the story of the annual and you know, the changes in the adaptations we had to make with COVID. So, but ended up having a really beautiful show and some really large works. I think this is a show of giant paintings and sculptures and whatnot and installations that I really loved seeing. Before we begin, I'm just going to take a moment to do some thank yous. Specifically to our supporters within the foundation community, the Heinz Endowments, the Pittsburgh Foundation, the Buell Foundation, Allegheny Regional Asset District, and the Hillman Family Foundation. They've been really wonderful with their support, especially in the midst of a pandemic, which we all know, as well as the Arts Equity Reimagined Foundation team. I want to thank our individual donors. So those of you who gave over Giving Tuesday and the end of the year, thank you so much. My board, my exhibition committee, 2 members who I know are here and talking with us today. My staff, Jamie, who's on the call, as well as Isaac, who's out managing this space, and our members. We really, you know, you all are the reason that we do all of this. So thank you so much. Right. Let me pull up. So today we're going to hear from artists Sheila Cuellar-Shaffer and Laura Krasnow. Laura was born in New York City and has lived and traveled throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. In addition to being a freelance photographer, Laura has worked as an assistant editor in feature films and has been trained in film preservation and restoration. Her artwork has been exhibited throughout the US and Europe and is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art and the Brooklyn Museum. Her passion is art, science, and technology, which you will see we'll get into today. After obtaining an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, she returned to school to study math, physics, and computer science, and she has attended seminars at the Parameter Institute of Theoretical Physics and the Center for Brain and Mind, both in Canada. So Laura, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Shayla, come on. Shayla is a Colombian American artist, primarily a painter and designer for over 20 years. A native of Palmira, Colombia, she graduated with a degree in architectural design from the Fundación Academia de Dibujo Profesional and studied fine arts. Studied fine arts at the Instituto Departamental de Bellas Artes in Cali, Colombia. My mother is from Colombia, so Shayla's probably, you know, giving me a little push to speak a bit more Spanish with you all. Shayla's practice represents her interest in identity, diversity, and human rights. Her work has been shown at the Carnegie Museum of Art, Susquehanna Museum of Art, Kisnick Gallery at Brandeis, the Westmoreland Museum of American Art, and the State Museum of Pennsylvania. She is invited to show her work at the Pennsylvania State Capitol and the U.S. Department of Energy. In 2018, her design Democracy is Power was chosen by the Amplifier Foundation curatorial team, which included Shepard Fairey and America Ferrara, to travel around the country with Power to the Pools. In 2020, Shayla was awarded funds from the Heinz Department's Just Arts program as lead artist of the recently completed Billboard Art Project, which was really great. I loved driving down the turnpike as well as over towards Greensburg and seeing those billboards. She serves on the board of directors of the Westmoreland Diversity Coalition and of Associated Artists of Pittsburgh, and has recently been appointed to Welcoming Westmoreland, a broad-based coalition taking on diversity and inclusion across Westmoreland County. Her work has been mentioned in publications including Forbes.com, Bloomberg City Lab, and the Boston Globe. So thank you, Shayla, for joining us.
Thank you, Marlene.
All right. So again, today is the last day to see the annual. If you are in town, we're here today till 2. This part of the annual, again, works will still be on view at the airport into March. So the works we're going to talk about today are the 2 works on the screen right now. Both works are on view at the Detective Building. On the left is the piece Unexpected Encounter by Shayla, and on the right is the piece Pandemic Dance, Neutrinos Folly, in parentheses, by Laura Krasnow. So one thing I found incredibly interesting about both artists and the work and my conversations that I had with them prior is how the work really delves into what is kind of a term that we throw around a lot, but the works themselves become a site of intersectionality. For Laura, really investigating ideas of science and art, and for Shayla, looking at issues of identity and diversity in her own background and these various pieces. So both Laura and Shayla are on our exhibition committee, which is really wonderful for me, but I felt like an interesting point of view of kind of knowing the nitty gritty that goes on behind the scenes to make these shows happen. So Sheila, let's start with your piece first. And I just kind of want you to, talk us through the work a little bit. I know in our own conversations, we talked a lot about color and form and figures and narrative. But yeah, just introduce us to Unexpected Encounter. Oh, you're muted. Shayla.
Oh, I need to mute myself. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Marlene, for having me today. But before I talk about my work, I want to say I'm just one of the millions of humans that have to leave their country because of violence. So that fact has shaped my work. I would say for many years, I was focused on just my own experiences, and that's what my work was just focused on my own experiences. But then after seeing the many changes that our country and our society has been through, that changed the work from individual to go to a community. So the work has been shaped for what the changes I see in not only in my community, but around the country. This particular piece is about a real story. Unexpected Encounter is about a story of an immigrant who had to go through many obstacles just to be here. So like this work, I try to, if you think about immigrants and immigrants crossing the border, you never think about them like wearing fancy clothes or anything like that. So I try to lift up these women by putting on their fancy clothing. And I think also, and think about like what has influenced my work. It's been like colonial art and pre-Columbian art, and you can see that reflection also on the way the woman is dressed and how the head is shaped to give her like some dignity and lift her up.
Yeah, I mean, so much of when I look at this piece, I think of like Goya's portraiture of the Spanish royal family, or so much other portraiture throughout European art history. A lot of your work kind of quotes it, kind of echoes it. we talked a little, for me, I love the skirt and kind of the flattening that happens with the deck art themes, and along those lines of other tools that you utilize, you also use color very intentionally and very specifically. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to your use of color in this piece.
Yeah, when I think about color in many instances, I think before I think of the composition itself, just it's more like an abstraction to me on what colors I want to use and where I want to place them, and then I kind of go from there. And then it's like a narrative for me how to shape the idea that I want to portray. In here, I'm thinking about like my idea was thinking about all the obstacles that an immigrant goes through just to have a job. How are they received? And living in Westmoreland County, where minorities are only 5%, and that includes African Americans, immigrants from all over. It's a very challenging situation. So I've heard many stories that are not, that are very difficult to hear, and that kind of shape this. If you see, there are certain elements, not only the clothing, but if you see like the candy and the cakes and all that, that comes from my series before, which was like Candyland, the Land of Hope, and how I just find very interesting how the power structure works, and how I always think about this phrase, sugar-coated reality, how the ideas are presented to the general population so people believe them. And that's kind of the idea behind of this. This guy here, I think of them kind of like they're like people, like they could take on personalities, or they can repeat like from one painting to the other. And then if you see the mouse here in the painting Unexpected Encounter, and you think about the duality of the baker, is the title related to the baker and the woman, or the baker and the mouse? And it's kind of like a question, for people to think about that. And
yeah. No, I mean, I think specifically in relation to your conversation around immigration and the immigrant experience, there is an intense othering that happens. Laura, when we were talking together, you mentioned the word grotesque in relation to these works. There's an edge there. There's something that's a bit scary as you get into the details. Like for me, like the hairstyle, and you talk about your use of anthropomorphism in your work becomes like these almost these ram horns. That there's just, it's both like Queen Elizabeth and like that Elizabethan portraiture tradition with that hairstyle, as well as, like like I said, like just these rams that I associate with, the American Southwest or whatnot, but there's almost an armor to it. But yet those colors make it soft and inviting. I love the story you shared about a mother asking like, oh, can I get one of these for my daughter's room? And then like looking a little bit closer and being like, oh, like the teeth are a little bit sharper. And just kind of like also how your piece so wonderfully plays on proportion. You were talking about like shrinking the hands, and that brings like a nice demureness to it as well. So it's playing on expectations, and it causes us to kind of question our long-held notions of like, when we see someone that looks like this is what we think. and a work like that kind of flips it on its end. So we'll come back to you, Shayla. I want to make sure we get to everyone, and then to questions. So if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat, but then we'll also take time at the end to talk a little bit through. But on the screen now, Laura, is your work, Neutrinos Folly, or Pandemic Dance with Neutrinos Folly in parentheses. And I was wondering if you could introduce us to your piece.
Well, let me explain a little bit about the title. As I did a number of pieces during the whole beginning of the pandemic, and one of the things I came up with that I think we talked about, Madeline, is the idea of we're doing a dance in the pandemic, whether we have to figure out if we go food shopping, what's safe, putting on the mask. I mean, there is a dance that we're doing. And the other thing is, as Madeline pointed out, I am a total science geek, completely. And I'm really fascinated about astrophysics. And so I have a tendency my work is very much about physics theory, but not an illustration of the theory, but an interpretation. I like to interpret the theory in relationship to the photographing a real object. I think that's very powerful. When you just do an illustration, it's something that you can look at afar, you don't have any connection to, you go, oh, that's interesting. But when you connect it to what's going on around you, I think it's a much more powerful statement. When I do go out and I shoot, I never shoot one image. I always shoot multiple images. And I was thinking about this. I think that's related to my time I worked as an assistant editor in feature films. Editing in feature films is always about the relationship of one frame to another. And the editing process itself, I've seen incredible editors make different cuts between frames and totally change the meaning of the film. And it was just incredible to watch when you watch these men and women work. Also, multiple frames together signify a passage of time. So with this piece in particular, I also tend to shoot a lot with Polaroid film rather than just purely digital. These were done digitally. And I was just walking down, shooting this image of this wood stick on the floor. And I was trying to relate not only the position in a specific space and time, but also by me changing my point of view, the environment comes out as well. So, and as far as my little red squiggles, that's in all of my work. I really don't know why I started doing red lines. I did a lot of research and I noticed that one of the things I was doing was researching prehistoric drawings, which I love. And it was pointed out that one of the first colors that were used in these drawings on these caves was red. And so, you know, it seems like from the beginning of the human species, it had a meaning. And for the title, I don't know if you know what a neutrino is. A neutrino is a subparticle. It's called a fundamental particle. It can't be broken down into any smaller pieces. So, and it's born in like a supernova, which is when a star explodes and all the energy comes out. And it's thought it was one of the first particles that were created in the Big Bang. And the largest number of particles in the universe. And they've been doing a lot of research on that because it's believed that if they study the neutrino, they'll really get an understanding of the beginning of and the creation of the universe, which I think is way cool. And they're doing that at several labs. One is called the Sanford Underground Research Facility. They're doing research on dark matter there. And in Fermilab, which is connected to University of Chicago, they're in the process of building a huge accelerator so they could study neutrinos. And happily, I actually got a residency at the Sanford lab, which is in South Dakota, which was postponed because of this exciting illness that's going around. And I recently got one of my art pieces in an online exhibition. I think it might be this one and another one at Fermilab, which I'm very excited about. So my goal is to really, how I can utilize these incredible physics theories and interpret them in my own personal work, where it's, as I said, it's different than purely illustrative. And art and science is a huge thing right now. And there are a number of science research centers that have art residencies. One of them is CERN, which is in Switzerland. And I was fortunate enough to go to a panel where they had some of the scientists there. And they talked about how working with artists for some of the scientists have changed the way they approach their research. Rather than science tends to look at one little thing and just block out a lot of other things, where art tends to look at the whole. And for some scientists, they're beginning to expand how they do the research. It's very cool.
Yeah, one thing that when you were talking about the process is that constant return to the site to take these photographs, that it was, you know, that repetition and the idea of like of collecting data, of returning, of
right.
You know, almost like an experiment and a hypothesis that you're testing out, and you go, yep, the stick is still there, go back. Yep, the stick is still there, go back. But that red line also relating to that idea of that dance of that walk of kind of I wrote it down. I'm gonna try to see if I can find it. Like the movement of the dance of your walk of, you know, shooting these images over and over again, of going out, coming back in, and how much that relates to kind of how we're navigating. What is left behind? That's how you describe this red line. And can you talk about that specifically, like your conversation around time in your work?
In fact, I know later on you're going to show some other images of things we've done in the past, but it really is about a sense of time. One of the things I know I mentioned to you is that I was reading that there is no now, that what we see has already happened because of, I mean, it's a tiny little split bit of a second, but because of the speed of light and the brain to decipher the complexity of what we see, everything we see has already happened. So when I saw that, when I read that, I was, you know, there, as I said, there is only what we have seen and what we will see, because what we see is what we have seen.
Yeah, I felt like the repetition of the image and then the data line, like creating this archive, but the archive being represented in a single work of art.
Right.
I was just like, you know, I was geeking out when we were talking about that. Let me one more. Thank you, Laura. So this is Shayla. This is your work in context at the show. So if anyone hasn't seen it yet, again, we're open today till 2, but I'm gonna flip forward because I do love this image, because you mentioned like the idea of the unexpected encounter in this close-up of the little map. But I'm gonna flip forward because this work comes out of a larger series, and you provided some images from the series, and I've included them here, and if there's one you want me to flip forward to, just let me know. But I wanted you to, I guess, talk a little bit more about how this work relates to your larger body of work and where it fits in kind of everything else you're working on right now in relation to these comparison images.
This work was the first one of those series when I started to work with elements of, colonial, trying to mimic like colonial art. And when you think about colonial art and everything that happened at that time and how we learn our history in Latin America and how it is being told now in all the things that we see change, and the natives in Latin America, how things were, and how in many instances, even the natives would paint these angels in a way to, convey ideas for people to believe in Christianity. So I wanted to take those elements and focus on what is to be a Latin American now, a Latin American woman, a Latin American being, and lift up those people who are here, who are immigrants here. And when I used, if you see the bottom part of the painting, you still see like elements of the candy, like within the ground. And the little tower to the right is like how I was think how we immigrants are being, we are analyzed and seen in a different way. It's almost like we need to have a compelling story to show that we are here for a valid reason. And I think a lot about that. And also the little house, thinking you want to have like stability, and you want to have a community, and how that plays, and how you perhaps have you adapt without having to forget what you were.
Yeah, I think that word adapt and adaptation is really like hits the nail on the head, because like your source images here, you mentioned the angel, these images from Latin American Baroque art are often, copies of prints brought over from Europe that then indigenous artists were recreating for different classes and different levels. And so there's already this language of movement and travel that's happening just with that source material. And then to tell that story again in relation to migration from Central and South America to the United States. Like you started this series when Trump was in office, when, we still have these issues very much today. They're not solved in any way, shape, or form. Like people are still in unfortunate situations where it looks very cage-like, right? And so
I think it's gonna take a while for people not to be alienated by someone different. It's the big thing. We don't have to be alike to respect each other, to coexist.
Yeah, and another thing that happens with your work is, I always quote like magical realism and Colombian art, and Laura brought it up when the three of us were talking as well. but that like specifically in relation to place, like there is that sense of home, but what is home? Like what could home be? You mentioned that structure watching you, and that this work that you shared and the work that's in the annual, this use of windows of viewing into another space, whether in this case there's architecture involved, but that heavily influence of portraiture and how portraiture works and being seen and making space to being seen. And one thing that I loved when we were talking is use the phrase, how can I make this bearable? Like your work is where you are doing that. And I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that idea anymore, or if you wanted me to, if there's a specific one you want me to share from the additional
we can talk about all that. But I think people have seen all the images. If anyone wants to see any image in particular, so just let us know. But in general, when I saw so many changes in my community and in the country, and everyone's so divided, I felt compelled to paint about that. You know, I needed to express myself, and I started wondering how could I do that without getting totally depressed. So to make it bearable, I had to use pastel colors, and that was my way not only to make it easier on me, but also to the work itself wouldn't be so dark to start. They had, to me, like the work has to have contrast and some elements that like if you see in this painting, is not only about colors, the contrast in colors, but also in texture or parts that look unfinished, rather than like this is very smooth. The area like the sky is really smooth, and if you see the candy is like more defined, and if you could see a close-up of her face, has a lot of texture. And I wanted to, like talking about technique, I wanted to paint in this particular painting. I wanted the face to have texture, and that you could actually do a brush stroke, and with that making the shape of the face without having to lift the brush. And it's like layers after layers of paint to get to where I wanted to be here. And the fact that there are like unfinished parts also created for me like what I needed here. It kind of balances it out and unifies all the elements.
Yeah, no, I really see that when you're talking about like the treatment of the form. They almost like, you kind of want to read them in the faces as like worn down as time, as there's something haunting about it, but it's the face is treated the same as the background, as the landscape. There is kind of this wonderful flattening that happens, that like this is an an interpretation and understanding of experience. I'm going to flip ahead again because your work is still on view, will remain on view until March at the airport. We do have a reproduction here. There's an image there, but I do want to go back to the original painting real quick if I can, and we'll just use this one in context. What you mentioned, that use of line to kind of, or that use of the brushwork to complete the face, and it making it appear as one. And you pay such close attention to the face, but then everything else is kind of, I already mentioned the small hands, but I think of like this skirt, like this skirt is just so wonderfully flat, like it's so decorative. And so that you have these different techniques going on into the work. And I didn't know if you wanted to share a bit more about that thought process, like making, the hands smaller, or the face a bit more grotesque, or the body, like using that decorative patterning for the skirt, where it's not about like seeing legs, but like about seeing like this very flat pattern. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, yeah, to me, the outfits really are about lifting up the immigrant women. That's when you think about the immigrants, most people think about, and that's the way it is in most cases. We come here with nothing, and we have to start building from there. So, and when you think about, it's kind of, and I think a lot about like women that cross the border, they don't know if they're gonna make it actually, but they do it for their families, right? And when you think about saints, you think about extraordinary people, just normal people that did something extraordinary. And to me, the fact that you risk your own life so your family can have food on the table, that is something extraordinary. And that is something worth painting about. Thinking about all these stories
yeah, and to your point, it's not pretty. It's not a pretty picture. It's not an easy thing. It's very, very tough. But almost to put it on the canvas and make it known and make it seen, you do add, you know, in this figure, like this really beautiful skirt and these sleeves and these booties. Like there's just something that like speaks to the specifically like European lexicon of like, this is what is beautiful. This is like what we should, you know, reproduce and put out there, and that's like the visual language that I'm trained in. And so I see that and I read it, and then you get to the faces, like there's a kind of a flipping of it on its head that I really love.
and if you see the dresses, can we go back to the in between? The other one.
Oh, the other one, sorry.
Yeah. Like if you think about here, like there are the brush strokes and the paint, they're like, if you see, it's very smooth, and then, but if you see the arms are not as smooth of the fingers, and if you see the face, so again, I'm working on that contrast of the elements here, that if you see on the left-hand side, it kind of looks like if it was unfinished, and sometimes it, to me, has to look that way. It has to have that contrast. And it's funny that you mentioned about the influence about Garcia Marquez, and because when you leave your country, you feel very, it's like you analyze more your background and your identity than if you stay in Colombia, because you're there, you're there. When you leave, you start thinking about who you are. And it's funny that these things come back after so many years of living in the United States. Those elements that I saw, like when going to the girls' school in Colombia, Catholic school, like we went to church every week, and those, like seeing the saints and going to the museums to see the colonial art and the little museums with pre-Columbian art and artifact, that follow me. That's still very much part of me, and I think it's going to be part of my work, I don't know, for a long time.
Yeah, I know. I always feel my most Colombian when I'm with my mother in Franklin. When I go to Colombia, I feel like I'm American. So to your point, I think it's very true. I want to come back to Laura's work, and specifically, Laura, you had, let me include these images. Oh, here's the work again in the space. But I wanted to ask a bit about the images you included and how they relate to the work that's currently on view.
Well, this was shot with Polaroid film, very little manipulation. And it was the first piece I did in multiple frames like this, where, excuse me, there was a stick on the ground. I seem to be obsessed with sticks on the ground like a dog. Uh, and I shot it just walking down, and it matches, one matches the other. So this is the one, and literally it was called Assemblage. And you'll notice that these final pieces are very big. Because, you know, when you create something small, it's like a little precious object. But when you create something big, you're creating this entire environment, and you're inviting the viewer to come into this world that you created. So this was the first piece that I did that was very large. And if you go to the next one, yeah, this again, if you look at it, it's actually the same. If you look at the first frame, it's the exact same portion of the stick in every single frame. I just enlarged it. Again, this was also shot with Polaroid, and I created this. Hopefully, I created almost like this little movement, this sense of moving down the line. And this was huge. It was like 92 by 29 inches. And I actually sold this to a corporation, and I print my stuff myself. And where I was printing it, people were walking by the door, and it just kept on coming out of the printer. It was like, it just wouldn't stop coming out of the printer. And I love the fact that it was that large. And if you go to the next one, this was even larger, 120 inches. And this was part of an exhibit I had in Philly. And I was also doing a lot of work relating to memory, and how when you think back a specific time, the time that the experience you had since that time, and the time that actually passed, your memory is not the same as when it happened. It changes. So with this piece, it was taking the same images that I did of that the piece prior to that, and I started manipulating it by the density. So to me, it represents how you recall a experience and how it changes over time. Sometimes it's very clear, and then it starts to fade and it becomes something else.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when we were talking, because you mentioned the colliders and how when they were trying to get these images of neutrinos, like it's so hard to get the image. It's like it was like they have to get the after image.
Right. They can't actually get the image itself, which is actually happens a lot in physics. You can't get the image of the actual thing, but you can get the image of how it affected the environment around it.
Yeah, and the interesting, I'll move forward, the interesting, like, both how art and science are seeking to see, like you said, they both want to get the image, that they're both seeking to see something.
And this one was actually, I went to that solar eclipse, was it like 2017? I went to South Carolina, and to a refuge that was packed with people, but it was fantastic. It was people were falling on the ground and applauding. It was amazing. And this was images I took of what was going on around in the environment itself. I got a full picture of the eclipse, but it was really fascinating to see how everything started getting darker. The birds stopped singing. It was so this and Curiosity is a rover that went to Mars, so it kind of, I combined them. And a lot too, like the lines themselves reminded me of these like Stonehenge, where you don't know what they mean, but there's some connection to ancient religious experiences. And being there during this eclipse was like that. It was just, and when it started getting lighter, people were jumping up and down and screaming like the sun's coming back. It was monumental.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was really interesting point that you brought up about red and its connection to, you know, understanding, like, I think like the wall paintings at Lascaux and
Right.
red clay, like dirt is red. We often think about it as brown, but it's like, no, it's red. But then coming back to data visualizations, like a red line telling you, you know, whether or not what's going on with cases or what's going on with the heartbeat or what's going on with this or that, like it's this color that is able to span both something very earthy, gritty, dirty, old in the best sense, and then high tech. Like I even think about when I go to like mute myself, it's a red line that goes over my microphone.
I mean, in the ancient sites, they're taking the earth and trying to make a connection to this spiritual understanding. And a way we're doing it again. We're still connected to that red line. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So we have a few minutes left. So I do want to open it up if anyone has any questions, to put them in the chat, to ask us, just to unmute yourself and ask. But I can keep moving forward on images again if anyone has any questions. One thing that Shayla, that coming back to your work, that I think this image shows rather well, and I talk about these being rather large pieces, like Laura, yours is, the way it's installed is rather huge as well, is that they are almost to human scale. And I was wondering if you could speak about that, like painting them, painting your figures to like a very, very lifelike human scale, as opposed to, you know, small, and making, what was the thought behind that choice?
Oh, I think that painting those beings like human scale, it's more lifelike, you know, and it's visually, if they will create more impact than painting something small or even larger. But I wasn't, but I'm not, in thinking about the beings, I'm interested in the human figure, but not exactly to be like human figures, because as you see, they have a little bit of zoomorphic shape in them. Perhaps this one only has something like in the mouth, but you see in most of them is what is left. It's what is left. In some of the earlier works, you would see more like a combination of the, see, this is like, it's more, they have more like zoomorphic shapes. Maybe the older work that we don't have here, but it's something that has always influenced my work, thinking about the combination of zoomorphic figures and anthropomorphic.
Which is so like pre-Columbian, like,
right.
And looking at kind of the, like the pictographs and like, I think of like, I have a necklace that that my mother got for me in Colombia, and it's kind of like a snake figure, but with like, but it's not a lizard. It's very much not a lizard. It's but then it has like a fuller, almost human-like face to it, like that combination that. But here you kind of have toned it down a little bit, which, you know, it teeters on a really like interesting edge of, are these pretty or are these not pretty?
Yeah.
Which I really love. I see if there's any questions in the chat. Andrea says, I feel like each artist approaches the concept of absurdity from different ends of the spectrum. Shayla using fantastical images to point a very real experience. Laura using real images and manipulating them to approach an abstract / unknown idea. What is the value of absurdity to each artist, both personally and universally? That's a great thread that you found between the two, Andrea. Thank you for that question. I'll turn it over to the artists.
For me, I don't know if I would use the word absurdity, but it's to understand, really. That's the way I look at it. I think I pointed out that when I use photography in my work, and it's really important for me to take a picture that someone can connect as being a real place, and that these huge, like, conceptual physics theory that seems so difficult to understand, I try to bring it down to this is happening around you. I don't know, Sheila, it's like other than I think your work is incredible. It's, I mean, I'll let you answer that.
Well, to me, absurdity is not it's not basically about the work, but the reason because I paint about this is the absurdity that we humans have to be talking about, that we can actually coexist if we're different. To me, that's absurd. And just the fact that we're having these talks around the world, there are people like talking about this. Is just really, we as humans have to be like this. It's just that idea. And perhaps because of that, and I think about like these beings, and I want them to have some sort of humor in them. Like they're not always like, they don't always look super serious, and I don't always see like super strong colors, but I have to have some sort of humor and pastel colors, and create a balance between the grotesque and the beautiful, and the ideas of hate in humanity, and creating like some space where everyone feels welcomed. And that, I think that will be it for me.
Yeah, I think about like, Laura, your work is like questioning absurdity, like something that seems wildly unreasonable really isn't, unless like the printing story at the printer with like it never ends. Like that almost feels like a sketch from something.
I know. My life is Monty Python.
Like trying to make something that feels illogical or feels unreasonable logical, and wrap your brain around it, like you said, like interpretation, not illustration. So like that emphasis on understanding, and kind of taking away those layers of absurdity. But I do think that, like Andrea's point, like there is a starting point where like the idea of like we're building these large colliders to run these tiny little particles into one another and burst them apart, and like how they interact is how, like, that feels a bit absurd to me, but I'm not like
but if you think about that, I like the connection between the idea of like they're building these huge things to watch something that is almost impossible to see, and we're just having an idea after, like we won't even be able to see it. And I love that connection between that, and we're talking about time, and how we think about time as a linear thing, instead of thinking of it in a different way. As you were saying, Laura, time, there's no present, but it's what we saw and we were gonna see. And that goes directly to that idea for me. The idea of building all this to see something that is already gone.
Yeah, and actually in outer space, there is no time. Time does not exist.
Right.
Which I understand where people have a trouble like getting their mind around these things that, you know, when I study some astrophysics and they talk about things that happened millions and millions of years ago, and suddenly our age seems not even a dot. It really changed my concept of what's, I guess also when you get older, you sort of like, oh, it doesn't matter. You kind of, it is hard to grasp. It really is.
Well, I mean, time is a construct because we are up. We have, but Dan does have a wonderful question here about influences, like with like David Hockney in relation to yours, Laura's, and Frida Kahlo in relation to yours, Shayla's, and we can touch upon that more. But yeah, like we are at noon, so thank you everyone for your hour of time. We ended with time isn't real, and it's kind of funny that I'm telling you it is. But so thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you everyone for being here.